Hello, AP Environmental Science, and welcome back. We're going to talk about waste generation and waste disposal, just what you've always wanted to talk about, trash. When solid waste material is deemed toxic or otherwise is harmful to people or the natural ecosystem, and it should not be placed in MSW landfill or even an incinerator, in these cases, special means of handling and disposing the material are required. And so we're going to discuss the proper treatment of hazardous waste and some of the legislation that is concerning it. So in this section, be able to define what hazardous waste is and discuss the issues involved in handling it. And also describe the regulations, which is the important part, which usually shows up on the AP exam, and the legislation regarding its hazardous waste. So hazardous waste is defined as liquid, solid, gaseous, or sludge waste material that is harmful to humans or ecosystems. Boom. So according to the EPA in 2001, over 16,000 hazardous waste generators in the United States produce about 34 million metric tons of hazardous waste each year. Only about 4% of them are recyclable. So the majority of hazardous waste is the byproduct of an industrial process like textile production or even cleaning just the machines that make things and manufacturing computer equipment. But it's also generated by small businesses like dry cleaners, automobile service stations, and even farms. Each individual household generates waste like 1.5 million metric tons per year in the United States, and that includes things like oven cleaners, batteries, lawn fertilizers, anything like that. All these materials have a much greater likelihood of causing harm to the humans and the ecosystem than other materials, and so they should not be part of the disposal process in a regular landfill. Most municipalities do not have a regular collection site for hazardous waste or household hazardous waste. Rather, homeowners and small business owners are asked to keep their hazardous waste in a safe location until a periodic collection process comes by. And so in every aspect of this treatment, the disposal of hazardous waste is becoming more and more expensive and more difficult than just to dispose of it in the regular old waste system. Households get filled with numerous substances like oil-based paints, motor oil, chemical cleaners, and it's easy to just pour them down the drain or just put them in the trash. So hazardous waste must be treated before disposal. That means the treatment, according to the EPA definition of treatment, means that you want to make it like less environmentally harmful. And so to accomplish this, the waste must usually be altered through a series of a more chemical process. Because of the dangers that hazardous waste presents, disposal has received much public attention. And at times, in the past few decades, hazardous waste sites have become commonly known as some sort of household name, like because lawmakers that can to the general public, they've mandated that hazardous waste need to be regulated. And so there's a number of laws that act specifically to cover hazardous waste. So let's discuss two of them. So the first one is the regulation and oversight of handling hazardous waste. So this regulation and handling falls under two pieces of federal legislation, the U.S. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and then the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. In 1976, RCRA expanded previous solid waste laws. Its main goal was to protect human health and the natural environment by reducing or eliminating the generation of hazardous waste. So under RCRA's provisionals like cradle to grave tracking system, the EPA maintains a list of all hazardous waste and works within businesses and states and local authorities, both to minimize hazardous waste generation and just to make sure that the waste is tracked and properly disposed of. But in 1984, RCRA was modified with this federal hazardous and solid waste amendment, which basically encouraged waste minimization and phased out the disposal of hazardous waste to land. The amendment also increased law enforcement's authority to order and punish the violators. All right, so this Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, is usually referred to as what we call the Superfund Act. And the Superfund Act is a common name for this whole law. In a 1980 U.S. federal government, it imposed a tax on chemicals and petroleum and just the entire industry in general. And so the funds to clean up these abandoned and non-operating hazardous waste sites, the authorities of the federal government used this funding to respond directly to the release of threatened substances that may pose a threat to human health. And so the Superfund Act is well known because a number of sensational cases have fallen under its jurisdiction. It was originally passed even though in 1980, and then of course it was amended again in 1986. The legislation has several parts. First, it imposes a tax on any chemical and petroleum industry. And so the revenue from this tax is used to fund like a cleanup or an abandoned of non-operating hazardous sites. So the name Superfund came from the provision. Also, authorities of this federal government respond directly to the release of any threatened substances, and that may pose a threat to human health. So under Superfund, EPA maintains a national priorities list, or an NPL, of these contaminated sites that are eligible for cleanup from these funds. So for a long time, very little Superfund money was dispersed, and a few of these sites underwent some sort of like remediation. But in about 2014, there were 1,321 Superfund sites, and at least one was in every single state, I think with the exception of North Dakota. I think New Jersey had 113 Superfund sites. California has the next highest number at like 97, and then I think we're at Pennsylvania 94, New York at 86. So I thought I might have a map here showing you all of this, but I don't. But I know that there's one in your textbook that shows you where the Superfund sites are. So it basically became very clear that there's disproportionately a larger number of illnesses that are possibly connected to chemical waste than have been diagnosed in a local population, and so the situation attracted national attention in 1983, and this is a famous contamination. It was so bad, it was called the Love Canal, and it was listed as the Superfund site, and its inhabitants of the area were completely evacuated. You should look up the Love Canal. It's a terrible, horrible story. In 1994, the EPA removed the Love Canal from the national priorities list because the physical cleanup had been completed and the site was no longer deemed a threat to human health. But since its inception, many of the observed Superfund areas, they have not had enough funding to clean that up. And so they're just waste sites that are just basically sitting around the country. And so the Department of Environmental Protection, especially in New Jersey, where there's 113 listed Superfund sites, believes that there's actually more than 9,000 sites where the soil or underground water contamination is now completely hazardous. The Superfund designation is reserved strictly for those locations of the highest risk to public health. And Superfund sites are managed solely by the federal government. In 1995, the EPA created the Brownfields program. Brownfields, like Superfund sites, are contaminated industrial and commercial sites that may require environmental cleanup before they can be redeveloped or expanded. You think? All right, so the Brownfield programs assist state and local governments in cleaning up contaminated industrial and commercial land that did not basically achieve conditions necessary to be in the Superfund category. These are things like old factories, industrial areas, waterfronts, dry cleaners, gas stations, abandoned landfills, rail yards. Those are like common examples of brownfield sites. And so the legislation has prompted this revitalization of several sites throughout the country. One notable site is the Seattle's Gasworks Park. In 1962, the city of Seattle purchased the land which had a which housed this like coal gasification plant, and they basically rehabilitated it into a park. And so after undergoing this chemical abandoned plant and turning it into like this environmental cleanup and making it a park, it's now like this beautiful landmark, and it stands as a reminder that the Brownfield program can potentially work. However, the program has been criticized because it's completely inadequate, and the solution to 450,000 contaminated locations around the country is not simple as just passing a law. So since the cleanup is managed entirely based on the state or local government, brownfield management can vary from region to region how successful that it actually is. So now you know the truth about your country and that there's hazardous sites leaking all over around our world. And so if you want to pick a safe place, pick North Dakota, because that's the only state without a Superfund site. Because of the difficulties involved in disposing hazardous waste, cities and industries sometimes they try to send their waste to other countries, and so that poses a whole new issue. There are numerous reports of garbage and ash barges that travel oceans to the developing world, and those countries are basically willing to accept our hazardous waste from the United States in exchange for payment. So perhaps the most famous story around this is the cargo vessel of the Kehan Sea, which basically left Philadelphia in 1986, and it left with like 13,000 metric tons of hazardous ash from an incinerator, and it traveled to a number of countries in the Caribbean in search of a dumping place. And some of the ash was dumped in Haiti, and other was dumped out in the ocean. And in 1996, the U.S. They were ordered that the ash that had been dumped in Haiti, that it be retrieved and returned to the U.S. And so after being held at dock in Florida, the ash was deemed like non-hazardous by the EPA and other agencies in 2002. And so that it was just placed into a landfill in Pennsylvania. Not really far from originally where it was. It traveled around the ocean for what? 1986 to 1996 to 2002. It was a long time, right? 27 years. Okay. So anyway, in 2003, there was another instance where there was a waste transfer in the other direction. So a Pennsylvania company that specialized in recovering mercury from a variety of products agreed to accept 270 metric tons of mercury waste generated by a company that was in India. And so during the manufacturing of thermometers, India had no facilities for recycling mercury waste. And the most of the thermometers manufactured at the plant were shipped to the United States and Europe anyway, so the transfer of material seemed appropriate, right? So the mercury was shipped from India to the United States, where the mercury was concentrated, purified, and then sold to industry users as a metal. And this company made a ton of money on it because mercury is actually pretty difficult to mine and to get into its purification forms. Regardless of what you might think, there are a lot of incinerators and operators of these plants where, you know, you can dispose of a lot of this stuff properly. Your book mentions a couple in Vancouver, British Columbia, in England, where there's a lot of people who are willing to use the right scientific technology and research to dispose of these harmful things. It just unfortunately comes down to one thing: money, money, money.